We're moving on now to Section 3, Masonry Placement. Now we move on to masonry placement. This will be broken down into 6 categories: general requirements, mortar, block, rebar placement, embedded items, and grout. 5 typical items have not changed in the new code. The initial bed joints shall be between 1/4 inch and 1 1/2 inch max. Head and bed joints shall be 3/8 inch typical. The head joints mortared from face equal to the face shell thickness. The mortar shall be discarded after 2.5 hours, and a 1 bar diameter clearance between masonry surfaces and reinforcing. Also in these items, there should be a 1/4 inch max mortar fin projection inside the cells, dowels to match the vertical rebar size and placement, and for high-lift grout walls, provide cleanouts at the bottom of each cell or use inverted double open-end bond beam units when cleanouts at every vertical cell. Mortar can either be specified by proportions or by property. Type S and Type M mortars are the only mortars that are allowed, and the mortar shall be required to have a mixing time between 3 to 5 minutes and discharged after 2.5 hours. For exterior glass masonry units, Type S mortar is required. As mentioned before, there are time limits set on mortar. The mortar must be used before 2.5 hours have expired. Also, as mentioned before, for fully grouted walls, the initial bed joint must be between 1.5 inches and 1 1/4 inches max. Also, as mentioned before, mortar must be in full contact with the head and bed joints with no more than 1/2 inch max mortar fin projecting into the cell. This is a typical detail of a masonry wall showing that the vertical reinforcing must match that of the size of the dowels. This is a typical wall detail showing cleanouts at the base of the wall. You'll see that it is very hard to clean out the cells when the foundation is below grade. This is another picture of a masonry wall with cleanouts. You'll see that there's ponding at the base, which is interfering with the cleanout of the wall. All cells must be cleaned out prior to placement of concrete. This is another typical detail for a masonry wall. It shows a starter wall. While starter walls are no longer required, they are recommended. However, cleaning and roughing the surface of the masonry is still required. The bond between the initial course of masonry and that of the foundation is the most critical. This is a picture of what you do not want to see in your starter block. First off, there are too many conduits in one location. Second, there are too many conduits in the cell. Third, the initial mortar bed is greater than 1.5 inches. It's not a level surface. There are broken blocks. The rebar is touching the blocks. I could go on and on all day, and remember, the starter block to the masonry foundation is the most critical. This is another picture of a masonry wall showing embedded pipes and conduits. Can you see anything wrong? There should not be any conduits in the last cell of a wall where there's vertical reinforcing. Here are 2 more pictures of cleanout in a masonry wall. Cleanouts are required in every cell. However, if you use open-end bond beam units, then the cleanouts can be required only where there is any vertical reinforcing, and the cells must be greater than 3 inches in length. For rebar placement, there is a minimum of number 4 bars at 24 inches on center, both horizontally and vertical. 16 on center max for vertical balls when you have a stack bond. There is an exception, however, for reinforced hollow unit masonry freestanding walls or interior non-bearing, non-shear partition walls that allows reinforcing to be spaced at less than 4 foot on center when you have running bond and 2 foot on center when you have stack bond. This is typical details of vertical wall reinforcements. So what's good and what's bad? Well, what's good is that the aggregate is exposed and it appears to have full head joints. What's bad? Well, there's mortar droppings in the cell, and we can't really count on the clearances between the rebar and the face shell. equaling 1 bar diameter. This is another picture of a masonry wall showing the vertical reinforcing steel. As you can see, the rebar has been bent. Misplaced rebar should not be bent without approval of the design structural engineer and DSA. This shows a typical problem that can arise in the field. You must maintain a 1 bar diameter clearances between the vertical reinforcing and the masonry. How does one go about replacing this? Give it some thought. Another few things to remember when placing reinforcing steel. The location of the rebars are critical to the strength of the masonry wall. That all tall dowels shall be braced during grouting. That the reinforcing shall maintain the spacing and clearance at all times. The tolerance shall be plus or minus 1/2 inch where D is less than or equal to 8 inches, and plus or minus 1 inch when D is greater than 1 inches and less than 24 inches. So what is D? These two sketches show what the symbol D represents. For reinforcing that is located in the center of the wall, D is between the face shell and the center line of the rebar. For reinforcing that is skewed to one side or the other, the D measures the longest length between the rebar and the opposing space. For walls spanning between pilasters, the horizontal balls become critical. Placement of verts may not always be at the center of the wall, and you should discuss this with your structural engineer or DSA prior to construction. These are typical details showing the vertical construction joint in a masonry wall. These details should be shown on the construction plans. These are a few more pictures showing vertical cells, identifying the wire ties that may be holding the face shells apart. Probably the most critical aspect of a masonry wall is at the end of the walls. Here you can see the horizontal walls with the hook details. Note that the hooked horizontal balls may be needed to be rotated in an 8-inch wall to provide the 1-inch bar diameter clearance between the face shells. Typical masonry wall rebar is ASTM 615 or A706. We mentioned earlier the new requirements for spacing of vertical rebars, and we mentioned that the foundation dowels are required to match the vertical rebars. We also mentioned that the openings greater than 16 inches require at least one number 5 rebar or two number 4 rebar in addition to typical reinforcements, and that you cannot have 2 layers of reinforcement in a wall unless it's greater than 12 inches thick. As far as embedment items and anchor bolts, the only change is where it's located in the new codes. The maximum diameter for an 8-inch wall is 3/4 of an inch. For a 12-inch wall, it's 1-inch diameter. We still do not allow L bolts or J bolts to be used in masonry construction. You must have 1 bolt diameter or a minimum of 1-inch spacing. The embedment shall be per the plans, and there is no wet setting of anchor bolts. This is the typical detail shown on most DSA approved plans for anchor bolt installation. It shows the clearance around the bolts, the clearance to the back of the bolt, to the back face shell, but it should also note that it must be used in a template and anchored into place prior to placement of grout. This detail might be hard to see, but it shows an anchor bolt that's being embedded next to the face shell. You must maintain a 1/2 inch grout space between the bolt and the block at all times. This is a typical detail of an anchor bolt embedded into masonry. You'll notice that there's got good separation around the anchor bolt. However, what is disturbing is the separation at the head joint. This must have been caused by setting the template to hold the anchor bolt in place. It can't be mentioned enough that the anchor bolts must be secured in place prior to placement of grout. There is no wet setting. These are 2 typical details for placement of anchor bolts or headed stud at the top of the wall. The sketch on the right is not DSA approved because there is no way to secure the bolt in place without wet setting because there is no way to place the grout in the cells. Here is another illustration of a common problem with misplaced embedment items. This strap is required to anchor the wall to the roof diaphragm for horizontal forces. The offset in the strap will straighten out during an earthquake or windstorm, which will cause the nails to pull out and may result in a complete collapse of the building. These are 7 items you should check prior to placement of grout. The grout should be coarse. The grout slump should be between 8 and 11 inches. All cells should be clean. No mortar projections greater than 1/4 inch. Reinforcement and embedded items should be securely anchored. You should have a vibrator on site. Grouts of the wall shall be cleated in 1 day, not greater than 1 hour unless you're using high lift construction, and 1.5 inch deep construction joints when pour is stopped for greater than 1 hour. Grout admixtures are approved by DSA. They help reduce early water loss and produce expansive actions. You must verify the admixtures are being installed per manufacturer's instructions, and admixtures will come with the truck and be added to the truck on the site. High lift construction on masonry walls is allowed on DSA projects if they meet the requirements of DSA IR 21-2.19. The maximum height of a high lift for an 8 and 10 inch wall is 12'0", and for a 12 inch wall it's 16'0". Usual lifts are 4'0" max, but if your block is 10 inches or thicker, you may use up to 5'4" max heights. There must be consolidation and reconsolidations between placement of pours. For grouting in low lift construction techniques, the maximum height is still 4'0". However, as mentioned before, there is an exception for block that is 10 inches or greater in thickness that is allowed to pour up to 5'4" in height. That being, all cells are clean and the grout pour stops 1.5 inches below the top of the top masonry unit. Also, with placing a grout, keyways are required at the top of the pour. California Building Code 2104A.1.3.1.2.2 limits the maximum pour to 4 foot high, unless, as mentioned previously, you have 10 inch or greater block, in which case you're allowed to pour up to 5'4". Also, when placing grout, the grout space width must be calculated in accordance with TMS 402-16, Table 3.2.11, footnote 3. This is critical since congestion may occur within spaces during placement of grout. Congestion can cause voids to occur on the wall that is not visible following construction. Grout shall be placed so that all spaces to be grouted do not contain voids. This is what can happen when sufficient clear grout space is not provided. This particular case was discovered when the electrician went to drill a hole for a conduit. This is a picture of a masonry wall getting high lift grout. This is the first lift. One key issue that does not meet here is that the head joints are not fully mortared. This does not meet TMS 602-13, Article 3.3b.4. Again, another picture of a masonry wall that is being used under high lift construction. You'll notice that the grout has started to harden around the rebar and must be removed prior to placement of the second lift. Also very critical when placing of grout is that the cells are vibrated rigorously during construction.
Goes down about an inch. It goes down about an inch the first time and about an inch the second time.
This is a typical picture showing the consolidation following high lift grouting procedures. This appears to be the top of the wall since there is no vertical reinforcing projecting out of it. But beware This happens all the time, and the grout must be placed at the top of the wall. Consolidation and curing the grout following the placement of the grout should meet the requirements of DSA IR 21-2.13. Reconsolidation of each lift as soon as the grout has taken its settlement shrinkage, which in itself is hard to determine. It's usually between 10 minutes with a maximum of 16 minutes. These two red arrows point to two problems with this grout puller. The left arrow shows that there's cracking in the joint, which means there was excess water and this grout should have been reconsolidated again. The arrow on the right shows that there is movement around the rebar, which means the rebar was jostled or moved during the placement of the grout.